Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Facts on the Ground. I'm Jesse Zerwell, and I'm going solo today because my co-host, Misty Winston, is busy with her daughter's birthday. So happy birthday to her daughter, and I hope the festivities aren't too crazy. So that being said, today we're happy to have back on the show Miko Peled. He's a writer, he's an activist, he's been very outspoken over the years against the so-called state of Israel and the apartheid and genocide it's been uh, battering the Palestinian people with, trying to erase the Palestinian people with. And there are several incidents that have gone down lately that are really bringing back to the fore how brutal, how genocidal Israel has been toward the Palestinians. So we're going to talk about those today. And I want to thank Miko for joining us again. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Absolutely.
So let's start with the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem, occupied East Jerusalem, where there's been a lot of attention focused on evictions of six families from their rightfully owned houses. Can you expand on that more, and also expand on why it's important? Because Israel has a history of these sorts of evictions, but why is this one so important? Not that the others aren't, but why is this one really piquing people's interests and upsetting people?
Well, Israel, and by the way, thanks for having me on your show again. Like you said, Israel takes away Palestinian homes and claims that the homes or the land used to belong to Jews, and they've been doing it all over Palestine and all throughout Jerusalem. And the what is happening in Sheikh Jarrah has been happening for, I don't know, a decade at least. I mean, I remember going to protests there a very long time ago against these, and it's basically the state of Israel continues to do what it does: kick out Palestinians and throw in these settlers who have nothing to do with the homes there, have nothing to do with the neighborhood. It's a very high-profile neighborhood. I mean, there's some really important institutions in Sheikh Jarrah. The very famous American Colony Hotel is there. The Dar al-Tifl al-Arabi, which was a school and orphanage that was built by the remarkable Hind al-Husseini, who was an educator and a very, very prominent woman. She built it as an orphanage and a school for the children who survived the massacre of Dir Yassin in 1948. It's still functioning as a school, and a regular school, and also a boarding school. Hind al-Husseini a women's college named after her, is right there also in the neighborhood. The Orient House, which is a magnificent home that was built by the Husseini family in the 19th century, I believe. And then it was used as a center for political and cultural life in the city, in Jerusalem. You know, it's just a very significant, and of course, the mosque of Sheikh Jarrah, Sheikh Jarrah, the name himself, Hussam al-Jarrahi, he was there in the 13th century. He was Salah ad-Din's surgeon. So I mean, this is a significant neighborhood, both historically, culturally, and politically. And it's an opportunity. Look, these various Zionist organizations are sniffing around everywhere they can, particularly around Jerusalem, to see if there is any case that can be made that Jews used to live somewhere recently. In other words, in the last 100, 200 years, and then if Palestinians live there, boom, that's it. They did the same thing in Silwan. There was a small Yemenite community that immigrated to Palestine in the late 19th century, and some charity built some homes for them in Silwan. They left, after that, and they were moved, and they had nothing to do with the neighborhood anymore. But now, recently, they found that they decided they were going to evict Palestinians from the area where these homes used to be, because 200 years ago, Jews lived there for a short time. So, I mean, this is what they're doing throughout Jerusalem. Certainly within the old city, they're doing the same thing, even though they're going into the Muslim quarter and evicting people from there as well, and the rest of Silwan as well. So, I mean, this is an ongoing process, but Sheikh Jarrah is prominent. It's a prominent neighborhood. I have friends who live there, a couple, they're both professors, and they are slated to be thrown out August 1st. And they end up going to the Israeli courts, but the Israeli courts, of course, never rule in their favor. So
Right.
what are they going to do? This couple that's lived there their entire lives. I think the wife grew up in that home. So I mean, where are they supposed to go? Where are all these people supposed to go? And there was a real outcry, and there have been protests against these evictions and against this process for a very long time. And now they've become very violent, of course. And Israel has sent its most vile, its most fascist, right wing militants to go and do the work on the ground, to instigate, to incite for violence. And that's what they've been doing. And Netanyahu is, laughing all the way to the bank.
Right. And speaking of Netanyahu, about an hour ago, a Times of the UK article came out quoting Netanyahu as saying, or pledging actually, that he's going to continue bombing Gaza, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But going back to what's happening in East Jerusalem in Sheikh Jarrah, I think it's super important when we talk about this, when we talk about instances like this, evictions, to hammer home the point that a lot of the Palestinians who are being evicted have deeds to their homes. They have keys to their homes dating back to Ottoman times.
Yeah.
And the fact that Israel can just come in and say they don't have the proper building permit, or use that as an excuse to repopulate the old city, to repopulate occupied East Jerusalem with Jewish colonists. And I think that point needs to be made, that there is an indigenous Palestinian community, and they have the documents to prove it. They have the receipts, and whatever Israel and Zionism tries to put forth to negate that can be easily discredited by reading the history of what's been happening. But
yeah, I mean,
people need to know that.
This is absolutely true, and it's true throughout all of Palestine. There are, close to 6 million Palestinian refugees in refugee camps who have the deeds and the keys to their homes. The all of Jerusalem was Palestinian. West Jerusalem, which has now, become a part of Israel after 1948, was Palestinian. There are large, neighborhoods that are still there with beautiful homes, and the owners still have the deeds and still have the keys. And yet, Israeli families live there. Israeli businesses operate there, boutique hotels, restaurants, stuff like that, because they're gorgeous. And Jerusalem is filled with, homes like that and neighborhoods like that. West Jerusalem, which has been subjected to a complete ethnic cleansing. In other words, not a single Palestinian was allowed to remain in West Jerusalem. You may know the story. It's in my book. My mother was offered one of these homes in 1948 and refused to take it. She said, how can I, at age 22, she said, how could I possibly move into the home of another mother of a family that now has to be refugees? She was appalled by the idea. And but others did, of course. And this is the process that's been going on. And they all have deeds and they all have the keys. And if the houses or the town or the neighborhood has been destroyed, they can still find it. And they know where the mosque or the church was and their home was. So this is true everywhere. And really, because I think Jerusalem is high profile and Sheikh Jarrah is a very important neighborhood, like I said, historically, culturally, politically, it stands out. And from time to time, something stands out,
Mm-hmm.
But we have to connect the dots, and what is happening in Gaza, what is happening in the old city, what is happening in AlAqsa Mosque, what is happening in Sheikh Jarrah, the fact that it's all happening during Ramadan, and the fact that Netanyahu has got political problems at home. These are all the things that are connected. This is all part of the same process.
And the fact that everything Israel does, especially with regard to erasing Palestinians and their culture and their history, especially because I forgot the point. What was the point you just made? It was building off of what you just said.
That all of these things are connected, and they're connected to Netanyahu's political problems.
Right. Okay, I think I'll just leave it at that. And oh, actually, what I wanted to say, now I remember, is that there's a historical connection too, because Sharon did a very similar thing in 2000, which set off the second Intifada, when he came with about 1,000 strong retinue to AlAqsa or Haram al-Sharif,
yeah,
whichever you choose to call it. And as I just said, it set off the second Intifada. So we've seen this before, and Israel has a historical record of doing this. And I think we need to point that out too. We need to point out 2014, 2008, 2009, 2012. It goes on and on and on. And without that historical context, none of which we're getting from mainstream media in particular, there's no way to really understand what's happening. It just seems like senseless violence that's always blamed on Palestinians, especially Hamas.
Yeah.
So context is important. And with regard to AlAqsa, I think we would do well to remember what's already happened and what that set off. But going from there, I want to move over to Gaza and the Israeli airstrikes that have been taking place there, and the so-called rocket fire that's been landing in Israel and essentially creating potholes in the street. Although apparently a rocket did kill 2 women over the last 24 hours in Israel. But how is what's happening in Gaza? What is happening in Gaza right now? And how does that connect to what's happening in the West Bank, in occupied East Jerusalem?
Well, some of these rockets have fallen in my neighborhood where I grew up, where my mother and my family still lives, just outside Jerusalem, in the outskirts of Jerusalem. You know, I've got family members sending me pictures of the smoke bellowing from the rockets. So it's hitting very close to home. And look, the Palestinians in Gaza are no different than the Palestinians in Jerusalem. AlAqsa in Jerusalem, they are as much a part of them as they are a part of Gaza. In other words, Palestinians responding in Gaza to what is happening in Jerusalem is perfectly normal. It's like saying, how come, there's no division here. The division is completely artificial.
Right.
And when Israel attacks AlAqsa, it attacks Palestinians everywhere, and Palestinians everywhere choose to respond, and they respond. I mean, we saw this great picture in Lid, which was subjected to a horrific ethnic cleansing in 1948. Young Palestinians, and Palestinians live there in horrible ghettos right now, jumped on a pole and took off the Israeli flag and put a Palestinian flag. Lid is, if anybody doesn't know, it's part of officially in 1948 Israel, And so, and the same thing in Ramleh and Yafa, Haifa. These are cities that are, these are Israeli citizens, of course, which is meaningless. But in the context, people usually think of Palestinians protesting and responding in the West Bank or Gaza. They don't think about it in other parts of the country. But it's all Palestine, and the connection is clear to them. If Israel is desecrating AlAqsa, of course it touches people in Gaza, and it touches people in the Naqab, and it touches people, Yafa and everywhere else. And so they're responding, and I think they made it absolutely clear that they gave an ultimatum, and when the ultimatum was not met, they responded, and they're responding, as people respond when they're attacked.
Yeah, but the problem is in the West that the West feels entitled to start the clock with these attacks by Israel, these provocations by Israel, these slaughter sessions by Israel. Wherever it's convenient, they start the clock wherever it's convenient. So it's not that Israel committed a crime or crimes against Palestinians that provoked the rocket fire. It's the rocket fire that provoked what's happened at AlAqsa. It always starts with the rocket fire and Hamas, and then it's decontextualized even more because there's no historical perspective. There's no mention of the word occupied. I read a New York Times article recently about what's been going on, and I don't know how many thousands of words it was, but the word occupied appeared once. So that right there speaks volumes. And it's that media blackout, that decontextualization, that makes it so problematic for Americans, especially, to understand what's going on. And Americans should understand, because the US is Israel's biggest benefactor, and with weapons, with other indiscretionary funding, we provide them year over year. So I'm wondering if you can expand on that, the sort of narrative control or omissions that have taken place in the media to distort what's actually happening. And maybe you can expand on that with what you tweeted yesterday, which I thought was very on point, that there are no terrorist organizations in Gaza. They're in Tel Aviv.
Right. Well, Israeli army headquarters is in Tel Aviv. They always blame Hamas, or they always blame the Palestinians, I should say, because they say, well, they've got their military in areas that are heavily populated. Well, Israeli army headquarters is right smack in the heart of Tel Aviv. You cannot find a more heavily populated place to put a military headquarters. And my argument is that the Palestinians have never been terrorists. They've never engaged in terrorism. They've engaged in a completely legitimate resistance. Some was armed, some was not armed, but it's completely legitimate. Whereas Israel, the hub of terrorism in Palestine is the Israeli army, and its headquarters is in Tel Aviv. So, and I don't know if I'm sure many people saw this clip of the State Department spokesman, where he was talking about, yes, every state has a right to self-defense, and he was questioned, well, do the Palestinians have them? Are you recognizing them as a state now? I mean, do they have the right to self-defense? And are you going to comment on the killing of children and so on? And I mean, he slithered away like some slimy animal,
Right.
It was terrible to see, but he could not bring himself to say it is wrong of Israel to murder children, and yes, Palestinians have a right to self-defense. He could not bring himself to say that, whereas in fact that's exactly what is happening. Israel is murdering children. Israel is murdering innocent civilians, as it does, and it gets the full backing not only, by the way, of the United States, but of the European Union as well.
Yeah.
And nobody's condemning Israel. Everybody is saying, these are clashes. The war has to end. This is not a war. These are not clashes. This is a brutal attack against Palestinians during Ramadan in the holiest place in Palestine and the third holiest shrine for Islam in general, in Masjid al-Aqsa, in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. I mean, there's no greater desecration. There's no greater disrespect to people's right to worship and to people's place of worship than what has been happening in Jerusalem, in Al-Aqsa, over the last month. And they know this, and they did this by design. They did this on purpose because they want they want to flare up the region. They want to flare up, just like you said, just like Sharon did in 2000 when he walked onto the Haram al-Sharif. He did the exact same thing for the exact same purpose. And so this time, I think it's going to be much worse, though. I think we haven't even begun to see the end of this, and this is spread far beyond what anything has spread, until now. I don't think we've never seen rockets falling so close to Jerusalem, and it was a long time ago since we've seen Palestinians outside of the West Bank and Gaza protesting like they have been, and being killed and injured the way they have been. So I think this is something for not only Americans. Certainly, Americans are paying for this. So certainly Americans need to, stand up and speak out. I mean, you're paying for this, for God's sakes. Why are Palestinian Americans, Muslim Americans, any Americans really, Arab Americans, and everybody else, why aren't they standing up and saying enough? Enough. We're not going to do this anymore. If you can use our taxpayer money for this, then we're not going to, do something. Speak up. Make sure that representatives, elected representatives everywhere from city council and school board up to the president understand that this is not acceptable anymore. That it's not we're not going to let it happen.
Maybe they can accept that, but do you think they'll ever be capable of publicly stating those?
I think we are going to see a time where if you don't wear a pin like mine, you're going to be an outcast.
I hope
I
so.
remember I remember the change from when nobody knew who Nelson Mandela was to the point where if you didn't wear a Free Nelson Mandela t-shirt, you were strange.
Right.
It was in the 80s, and this is exactly where we are today. I think we are going to be getting and I think what is happening right now may well be the catalyst that drives us to that point. But we are going to get to a point where any elected official does not wear a pin like mine that calls to boycott, sanction, and divest from Israel is going to be an outcast. It's going to be embarrassing. It's like today everybody thinks MLK was a hero. Everybody thinks Mandela was a hero, but they didn't say that way back then. We know that very, very well. And so this is where we are right now. And of course, I think we're going to get there. I just, wish we could get there faster so less people are killed.
Right. Right. And you brought up an important point earlier about the military headquarters being stationed essentially in the center of Tel Aviv. And I just wanted to touch on that briefly because we always hear that Hamas's rocket fire is indiscriminate. And it's never mentioned that these are essentially homemade rockets, which by design are inaccurate, but Hamas is not just firing them willy-nilly. They are trying to hit specific targets. And because military installations are embedded in cities like Tel Aviv that are filled with civilians, Israel can easily say these are landing indiscriminately and indiscriminately killing civilians. But there's no mention of the fact that Hamas may be targeting those military installations. And because they're using inaccurate weapons, but the only weaponry they have, it's pawned off as indiscriminate. I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little bit.
Well, I'm not an armaments expert, so I can't really speak to that. I don't really know. I do know that the vast majority of the rockets being fired from Gaza fall in, and hurt nobody.
Right.
And so that's the reality. I mean, I know two people were killed. The Israelis were killed. I'm not sure. I don't know about I mean, the actual details of how they were killed and what actually happened. But we know that they have not hurt anybody, or the vast majority of them have not hurt anybody, and that's a fact. And Israel there's nothing like the 1-ton bombs that Israel drops on Gaza.
Right.
And hundreds and hundreds of tons of these bombs are being dropped on Gaza. So, and decimate entire neighborhoods. So there's no symmetry, there's no comparison, I mean, morally, ethically, militarily, in any way, shape, or form, there's no room, there's no place to make any comparison between the oppressor, the oppressed, the victim, and the victimizer, the attacker, and who's attacking and who's defending. And there's no room. You'd have to be either a fool or a liar to say that there was any kind of symmetry whatsoever here.
Right. And yet in Western media, American media, that's all we hear. And one of the most recent New York Times pieces I read, for all my sins, I have a subscription to the New York Times to know my enemies. But one of the recent pieces I read, not once when it didn't even refer to East Jerusalem. They just refer to Jerusalem now, and contested, quote, contested neighborhoods, not stolen neighborhoods, contested, not occupied, contested. And again, that just goes back to the omission we were talking about. And if that's all Americans are getting, I don't see how they're ever going to be able to educate themselves on things like this. They hear them as flare-ups, as clashes, and it's completely whitewashed. And I wish I could be as hopeful as you. I think that day will come, and I wish it would come more quickly. But unfortunately, I think we're going to have to see a lot. We're going to be enduring a lot more, witnessing a lot more slaughter of Palestinians before we get there. Because Israel, like the US, I think is sort of in a dying empire state. And the actions speak to that very strongly. No official has to come out and say it. We can see what's happening with these imperial colonial ventures. So I don't want to keep you too long. We have a few more minutes, but I wanted to ask you about the different responses, the various responses, first from the Palestinian Authority or Fatah, and then the responses of both progressive US politicians and, I suppose you could say, more conservative US politicians.
Well, as far as the PA, all I heard was the ambassador in London, Dr. Hussam Zumlat, who used to be the head of the mission here in DC, and he spoke very well. I thought he explained very well. Hamas is not the issue. Hamas is not the problem. The problem is the Israeli ethnic cleansing. The problem is the Israeli assault in AlAqsa. I mean, he made it very, very clear. I think he did a great job. So that's all I heard from official, the official PA.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe the junior senator from Maryland, Chris Van Hollen, he condemned what is happening in Sheikh Jarrah. He condemned the Israelis. I believe Elizabeth Warren did as well, maybe Bernie Sanders, which is good. I mean, it's a step in the right direction. I mean, there's also the movie The Present that made it to the New York Times, and then the former CIA director said that Biden has to see the movie, which of course is very, very important. It's a good movie, and I think it tells a lot. So, people are, I think we're getting to the point where it cannot be ignored. And
But
I don't
we,
think it's anymore a question of Americans not knowing. I think it's a question of Americans not caring. And the thing is, we need to go from, because I talk, people know, I mean, some people don't know, fair enough, but many people do know, and still they don't do much. And so I think the thing is to care, not just to know. It's not enough to know what is happening. It's enough to it's important to care and get up and do something about it and demand change. To care that children are being killed, to care that children are denied access to health care, to care that children are denied water and so on, which is the case for Palestinians all over Palestine and in the refugee camps outside of Palestine. So I think that's what's needed. And these politicians, I mean, they need to know that just condemning is not enough. They need to stop voting for these huge aid packages to Israel. Israel does not need aid. They need to stand up and vote against them. That's what needs to
absolutely.
happen. And I said earlier, everybody from school board to city council to state legislature to people who go to national office, they all need to understand that they're going to all lose their jobs if they support Israel. That's where we need to be, and that's, I believe, here in the United States, that should be the ultimate goal. That if they do not stand with Palestine, if they do not call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, they will be out of a job. That's where we need to be. And again, it starts with the school boards, because what you talked about earlier, the laundering of words, that happens in the school textbooks as well.
Hmm.
School boards are voting for this, and school boards are aware of this. They need to know that this is not acceptable. And city council members and mayors go on junkets to, paid for by Israel, as are legislatures, state legislatures, and so forth. So
American police officers
yes, of
are
course.
trained
That's
by the
a whole
IDF.
other story. Of course, that's a whole other story. So I mean, that's where we need to be. We need to be at a place where elected officials know that it is not permissible to support Israel anymore. And to that end, we need to, we need to strengthen this struggle. I believe that should be our aim here in the United States.
Yeah, I fully agree with you that condemnation is not enough, but I fear that that's all these politicians are ever going to do is condemn through tweets or maybe tepid public statements. And you can look at what they say and really, if you deconstruct it, find so many omissions and historical inaccuracies. And
Of course, yeah,
as I mentioned before, we're starting the clock when it's convenient for the narrative they want to push.
yeah,
And you add to that the tremendous influence of the Israel lobby on American politics,
yeah.
from APAC to JDL to ADL, even. These are all groups that are meant to not just reinforce Israel's partnership or Israel being an ally to the
Well,
United
they're the
States.
watchdogs. These are the watchdogs, the Zionist watchdogs here in the United States. They're the ones who
Right.
make sure that everything ticks the way they want, that everything goes the way they want. Yes, absolutely right. Yeah.
So so you mentioned BDS, you're wearing the pin, and I've got this homemade sign back up here.
That's
And I fully agree with you with this as well, that I think it's the only game in town now as far as helping Palestinians achieve whatever self-determination they want for themselves. And this has been repeatedly shot down in the US government. It's been condemned as anti-Semitic in not just the US government, but the UK government, elsewhere. As we wrap, can you just give a brief breakdown of what BDS is and how we can weaponize it, if you will, going forward to.
Well, it's the call from Palestinian civil society telling all of us what to do and how to help Palestine. I mean, that's basically what it is. They have very clear demands: ending the military occupation, allowing the refugees to return, and providing equal rights for all Palestinians. I mean, that's and Israelis, of course. I mean, that's what this is all about. And these are all. It's about justice, it's about equality, and it's about democracy, about freedom. There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing anti-Semitic with it. Quite the opposite. These demands are remedial demands. They're reasonable, sensible demands. They don't wish to harm anyone, and they wish to remedy the reality into which Palestine and Palestinians were placed as a result of the state of Israel. And so, I always refer to a speech in the Senate that Crispin Holland, again from Maryland, gave, and it was the first bill out of the Senate in 2019, where there was a portion of the bill that talked about delegitimizing or weapon or somehow criminalizing the call for boycott. And he said, this is the first bill regarding Israel that there's a question in the Senate about voting for it. And he said, I can't vote for a bill that tells my constituents they can't boycott because we have a sort of First Amendment here. We have that here. And to hear someone who's such a staunch Democrat talk like this, and he mentioned all the court cases in which these laws that were passed in so many states were thrown out because they are unconstitutional. So I think, this is part of the struggle. This is part of the reality. I mean, the other side is going to do whatever they can. They're going to do whatever they do. And we need to be steadfast, and we need to make sure, and again, use a politician like Crispin Holland to say, look, this has gone too far. How can you tell people not to boycott? And oh, by the way, how can you not boycott? How can you not bring the Sixth Fleet to defend Gaza? Why is the Sixth Fleet not? Why is there not a no-fly zone being imposed over Gaza when we know they're killing children? What else do they need to do? The Sixth Fleet is right there. Why don't they prevent Israel from attacking innocent civilians in Gaza and stopping this? So the more we push, the more progress we're gonna see. The more we sit down, the more progress they're gonna make. So we need to stand up, and we need to make a strong stance.
I think you're absolutely right. And when BDS sort of came on the scene years back, it was quite a bit more, or was quite a bit marginal. And I would say it's come out of the margins now. And people are understanding it a lot better and participating in it, even in small ways, not buying products that are manufactured in Israel or Jewish only colonies. So again, as I said, I think it's the only game in town, and a genuine way forward to, sorry, that was my timer. A genuine way forward to I don't want to use peace because it's so cliche, but yes, peace and justice for Palestinians. So I think that's a good place to leave it. Miko, thank you so much for joining us again.
Pleasure.
And
thank you.
I'm sure it's safe to say that you and I are going to continue to keep an eye on this story. And at Facts on the Ground here, we're certainly going to continue reporting on it. So our guest today has been Miko Peled. He's an activist, he's a writer, and we're going to link to everywhere you can find him and his writing in our show notes. And I apologize for my phone alarm going off in the background. But Miko, thank you very much.
Thanks
and
a lot.
I look forward to talking soon.
Talk soon. Bye-bye.
Take care.